Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our session on keeping a check on Earth's vital signs. So we're all used to keeping a check on our own vital signs. We wear Fitbits and Oura rings and other instruments to make sure we know how well we're doing and how healthy we are and what we're doing wrong and what we're doing well. So we need to do the same thing for our planet. We're at the critical point where knowing the science and knowing where we are with respect to our planetary boundaries is critical in how we develop the solutions of tomorrow. So this panel is about talking around what are those vital signs that we need to measure, why we're measuring it, how we're measuring it, and how we can use this data, more importantly, to come up with solutions. So with us today, and I hope we have the Zoom working, we have Johann Rockström, Director of Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research in Germany, who has been a veteran in trying to understand better what these vital signs are and how to measure them. We also have Lars Peters, Director of Greenhouse Gas Monitoring from WMO. Thank you, Lars, for being with us. And Dominique Worre, Executive Vice President of Imperatives World Business Council for Sustainable Development from Switzerland. So welcome all. And I'm just checking to see if Johan is joining us. Yes, no, maybe. Well, we can get started while we hopefully have him join us on Zoom. He's in Mexico City, so it's early morning for him. Oh, he is. Welcome, Johan.
Hear
Thank you
you.
for
I
joining
can hear
us.
you. Yeah, wonderful to be with you. I can hear you and see you very well, Anusha, and the rest of the
Awesome.
panel. So great to be
Thank
with
you.
you.
Thank you so much. So we're going to, maybe I have some questions to ask and get the conversation started, and we'll give you all a chance to participate as well. You can participate at on social media, as well as, just prepare your questions, and we'll have mics so you can ask those questions. Lars, I'm going to start with you. And what I was wondering is we were all, a lot of us actually, were at the Climate Week at the UNGA in New York recently, a few weeks ago. And the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, said that the SDGs aren't just a list of goals, they carry the hopes, dreams, rights, and expectations of people everywhere. Yet today, only 15% of the targets are on track. Many are going actually in reverse. So looking specifically at climate emergency that we have, why aren't we doing more? Why have we failed at what's happening? What's your thoughts on that?
Well, thank you very much for that question. And I'm going to answer in two parts because I will be speaking also partly for the Secretary General-elect of WMO, Professor Celeste Saule, who unfortunately could not be with us. She had a schedule conflict that became apparent yesterday. First, a little bit about, 2 words about me. I work for the World Meteorological Organization. For those of you who don't know us, it's one of the UN agencies. It's a specialized agency that is responsible for the international coordination of weather prediction and climate monitoring and related activities. Why are we failing? Are we failing? We are failing in two different things, I would say. So one is about warning people about what's going to happen to them immediately in terms of weather and climate hazards. This is a big priority of, I think, out of respect for the panel, I might decline this call here.
Please do.
Sorry about that. The UN Early Warnings for All initiative aims to get people better equipped to decide on the immediate weather and climate hazards. The other area where we could say that we are failing is in terms of actually mitigating the climate crisis that you were making reference to. So let me take the first question first. Early warnings for all. What does it mean to equip people to make better decisions in front of weather and climate hazards? I'm going to give you two examples of when and how it fails, and they are both from the rich developed world. you can take these case stories and then you can extrapolate them to the developing countries, and everything is normally worse there. But just to illustrate the kinds of problems that we're talking about, think of Hurricane Katrina. Many of you will remember that storm. It hit New Orleans in 2005, and it was very well forecast by the standards of weather prediction at the time. And yet, almost 2,000 people ended up losing their lives in that storm, mostly by drowning. Why did that happen in a country as rich and as technologically proficient as the United States? What happened was that by the time the evacuation order was given, most available means of transportation had already left New Orleans. So every single car, airplane, train, bus, etc. had left the city. So the people who were left behind had no way of getting out there. So this is maybe a bit of a simplification, but it was basically uncoordinated decision making. The left hand did not know what the right hand was doing. The second case story is a little bit closer to here. Some of you will remember floods in Germany in the Ahr Valley in 2022 in the late summer. Almost 200 and around 220 people ended up losing their lives there, mostly in Germany, some of them in Belgium, most of them in Germany. Why? The heavy rainfall was predicted quite well. Rainfall is a meteorological phenomenon. Weather forecasting is a federal responsibility in Germany, whereas hydrology, what happens to the water once it's on the ground, is a responsibility of the Bundesländer, so the states in Germany. And the responsibility to take action is delegated even more locally to the mayors. Many of the mayors apparently did not know this, so there was a lack of communication across the different levels of the government. Why did the mayors not know this? That's interesting because this was something that should not happen in Germany. This was what statisticians and insurance people call a 500-year event. So was Hurricane Harvey in the US when that happened. The floods in Libya were 500-year events also. What does that mean? If you have, in statistical terms, it means that it's an event that you should expect to happen only once every 500 years. If you have too many 500-year events, and if you read the press, you will see that almost every week there's a 500-year event somewhere on the planet. It probably means that there are no longer 500-year events. So in other words, the climate is changing rapidly, and it is changing rapidly in ways that we don't predict and we don't manage particularly well. I would like to show a slide now because I get to the second part of my question. What are we doing about the climate crisis? So there is a graphic here that I just want to speak to a little bit. So some of you will know this is the famous Keeling curve from Mauna Loa. So it is 60 years worth of slowly accelerating rapid growth of CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. So this is what has happened over the last 60 or so years. If you go back to the beginning of the industrial era, I don't know if you can see the scale here. This goes from 320 parts per million to 420 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. For most of the last couple of million years, that number was 280 parts per million. And for the entire human history up until around 1850, that's where we were. It is where all of our predecessors, the primates, the Neanderthals, etc., they all lived in this 280 ppm world that is comfortable for human development. Now we are on a very rapid rise, something that is unprecedented over the last 2-3 million years of the history of Earth. I should say that the Earth has a history of fairly violent climate change. Even more violent changes than what you're looking at here have happened in geological times. Those changes have generally been very bad news for whatever species inhabited the planet at the time when they happened. So that's important to keep in mind. This thing here is rising, as I said, at a rate which is unprecedented in human history. And we are seeing the consequences of it. So things that were 500-year events maybe 40 or 50 years ago are no longer 500-year events. We're not predicting this. We're not managing it particularly well. So just maybe to be a little bit provocative, I put the timelines of the major climate agreements on this graphic so you can see now that 31 years after Rio, the original UNFCCC inception, and 26 years after Kyoto, and 8 years after Paris, if you took the timelines away, you wouldn't be able to see them on the graphic. So those agreements were meant to bend this curve downwards. And I don't want to diminish the efforts that have gone into this, but I think we can agree that these agreements have not yet had the effect that we wanted them to have. So there is something here that we don't understand. What do we actually tell the parties to the UNFCCC? You all know that they meet once a year at the COP, the Conference of the Parties, somewhere in the world. There's generally 40, 50, or 60,000 of us meeting. And we discussed, we discussed this and we discussed what to do about it. So what the scientific community is able to tell parties now is how much CO2 they put into the atmosphere 2-3 years back. They tell parties that half of that CO2 disappeared somewhere. And we think half of that half disappeared into the ocean, the other half of the half disappeared into the land biosphere, and the other half stays in the atmosphere. That is how this curve gets to look the way it does. We don't tell parties, not because we don't want to, but because we don't know. We don't tell parties when and where and why this happens. And therefore, we cannot tell the parties how long this is going to go on either. What does that mean for the future? One analogy that I like to think of is that this is the equivalent of trying to drive a car down a road at fairly high speed while looking only out of the rear window. You don't have any visibility out of the windshield. You don't even see anything to the side. This could work reasonably well if the road is straight or curving very slowly and you're not driving too fast, but that's not the situation we're in here. We are driving very, very rapidly and we have no idea what the road ahead looks like. So I want to close by saying that there is actually a way out of this pickle. My organization, the WMO, is proposing something that is, or we have actually adopted something, but we are going to propose it to parties at the COP in Dubai later this year. An initiative called the Global Greenhouse Gas Watch that will tell parties in near real time, month by month, how much greenhouse gas goes into the atmosphere, how much greenhouse gas comes out of the atmosphere, month by month at every single location in the planet. This is information that we do not have available today, and I won't guarantee that it will compel parties to take action, because this is painful. I mean, let's be honest, this is not an easy problem, but we are going to present them with information in real time in a geographically disaggregated way so that they can see exactly why this curve looks the way it does, and hopefully start bending it downwards. I'll stop here. Thank you very much for the question.
Thank you, Lars. Johan, I'm quite depressed now, so maybe you can help us out of this slum. And I know that I was at UNGA Climate Week, and I know you were part of announcing the Planetary Boundaries and Planetary Guardian initiative, and you're instrumental in bringing that data together and making it an awareness tool for the world. And right now, one of the crises, I think part of what you mentioned, Lars, is that, you know, we have a hard time people believing in data sometimes. They the source of the data they try to say that is not trusted. So I'm hoping that this work maybe changes that paradigm and allows people to trust the source of data and all collaborate on the same vital signs. So tell us a little bit about the planetary boundaries and the planetary guardian work, and how do you see there may be a way for us to use this data to maybe bend that curve?
Yeah, thanks. But I will start by apologizing because I just have to, pour some more salt in the wound, as it were, before coming to the health check, because I just want to reinforce Lars' points here that, I mean, even the IPCC now today concludes that we have already reached the highest degree of temperature deviation from the stable Earth system if we look 100,000 years back. Actually, our latest science at the Potsdam Institute shows that over the past 3 million years, we never reached 2 degrees Celsius of warming, and we're following a pathway that will take us to 2.7, which I would argue, therefore, is unequivocally a path to disaster. And I would also say that Lars' points about the 500-year events, which is absolutely correct, and that's what's so special with 2023, this super El Nino year we're now experiencing, is that we're having once in a 500-year events across the entire planet. It's occurring on all continents simultaneously. And this is what I call reaching limits of adaptation, meaning that both human but also ecological systems are simply not able to cope because we are having 100-time faster change than anything that we've experienced geologically, and this is just too fast for adaptation. So just to kind of hammer home Lars' point, I also want to start this by saying that, as you've seen probably, the latest updates of the IPCC shows that the remaining global carbon budget for a safe landing to hold 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming is only 250 gigatons of carbon dioxide. That is 6 years of emissions today. So we've entered a decisive decade, and we know that we need to have cut global emissions by half by 2030 and a net zero world economy by 2050 to have any chance of a safe landing. So I would kind of argue that even though we're looking in the back rear mirror when it comes to our monitoring, we actually have some headlights on when it comes to the pathway forward. But the key entry point here to the planetary boundaries is the following. Even for a safe climate landing, there's no IPCC scenario, not one, that does not include essentially very optimistic assumptions on the other planetary boundaries. So the only way to hold 1.5 degrees Celsius is to phase out fossil fuels, according to the path I just mentioned, but also transition the global food system from source to sink in 30 years' time. It's a green revolution that is required. And third, we have to maintain what Lars also referred to, the intact carbon sinks in nature on land and in ocean. The 56% carbon dioxide that is absorbed in the biosphere as a response to the climate forcing. And remember that this absorption is not something that the planet does gently and harmoniously. It's a stress response to our energy imbalance. And then the fourth and final assumption in all these climate scenarios is that we'll start scaling carbon dioxide removal technologies. All of this has to happen simultaneously. There's no offsetting between them. It all has to happen simultaneously to have any chance of holding 1.5. And this is why we need a planetary boundary framework, because it means that the only way to have a livable, stable planet for future generations is that we not only phase out fossil fuels and have the energy transition, we need to keep within safe boundaries on biodiversity, on land, on fresh water, on nitrogen, on phosphorus, on aerosols, and our air pollutants and our chemicals. So that is the conclusion that we've landed in, that there's no escaping from being stewards of the entire planet. We've identified 9 planetary boundaries. This has been science that has been advancing for the past 15 years. We can today say with quite high degree of confidence that if we can manage these 9 and bring them back within safe quantitative boundaries, we have a good chance of holding the planet in this state that Lars was referring to, the Holocene state, which has been very, very supportive for developing civilizations as we know it. The latest scientific update, the one that we published just before New York Climate Week, shows unfortunately that 6 of the 9 boundaries are outside of the safe space. So it's not only climate, It's also that biodiversity, land system change. Just to give you a key fact on land system change, what that means is that we're rapidly degrading critical biomes on planet Earth. One of these biomes is the Amazon rainforest. The latest science shows that the Amazon rainforest, believe it or not, the Brazilian part of the Amazon, the largest part, has already tipped over from sink to source. This is the richest ecosystem on planet Earth on land, which is no longer helping us. It's no longer sequestering, it's actually releasing more carbon that it's absorbing. This is a very, very dramatic early warning signal. Fresh water, the same. We now conclude that we are actually taking out too much fresh water to groundwater rivers and too much soil moisture that keeps the whole photosynthesis functioning, which in turn is why nature can take up 25% carbon dioxide on land. So basically, the message is we are in the deep red on the resilience of the planet and at the same time having a deep red on climate forcing. So it's really about the entire planet. Now, to come to close on this, Anusha, on the positive side, so we now have so much scientific knowledge, and it actually confirms Lars' point that we can turn on the headlights now. Not only do we have quantitative boundaries that we measure against, basically the dashboard for the planet, we actually have the Earth observation systems, the modeling and computational abilities, the big data and artificial intelligence methodologies to actually keep track and do a health check of the planet. So at New York Climate Week, we promised now, and this is a tough but very challenging promise, but we've done it publicly, that every year we will be producing a planetary boundary health check, basically measuring the planet every year. This is a system which, has a chronic disease, multiple organ failure, and you don't currently, it's as if we have this chronic disease and we go to the doctor once every 7th year, every year of IPCC assessment comes out. And what do? We just measure the body temperature. That is, of course, completely insufficient. We need to go to the doctor every year and we need to measure all the organs, the living organs and the non-living organs, the climate system and the biosphere. That's what we've now promised as one guide for this return. And I can just close by saying that there are two transformations that are required. We know this is the energy transition and the food system transition. And actually, we have so much evidence that we have the scalable solutions to solve. We can actually, accelerate and scale exponential journeys towards a safe landing within safe planetary boundaries. It is actually possible. And that's why, actually, by the way, I'm in Mexico City because I'm chairing the Atlantic Commission on Sustainable Healthy Food Systems. We work very closely with Dominic and the World Business Council on this. It's really exciting to see all the scalable options we have to actually start driving in the right direction. And WMO is such an important partner in actually helping out with this measuring the extreme events and monitoring the state of the climate system. So I think we're kind of moving in the right direction, but much too slowly. Back to you, Anusha.
Thank you, Johan. Well, at X Prize, we definitely believe in what you said, and that innovation can help us, bring everything back into sustainable, safe areas. And we have 3 active competitions to talk about specifically some of those boundaries. So we have a carbon extraction competition looking at removing CO2 from the atmosphere at gigaton level. We also have an alternative protein system that helps address emissions from protein production, and that is also actively working. We have 1,300 teams in the first competition, so I'm quite encouraged to see how these teams will actually help bring some solutions to the market. And also we have a wildfire competition that also, it's a byproduct of the climate change, but also a contributor to CO2 emissions. That brings me to, we have innovators, we have solutions that are hopefully coming along, but we need to support those solutions and implement some of these solutions. So that brings me to you, Dominic. And what is the role of the private sector? How can we bring partnerships and solutions that the private and public sector work together? So if we have the innovation, making sure that we don't wait too long before it's too late to actually address some of these issues.
Well, Anusha, thank you very much for that. It's a delight to be here at CERN for this very important discussion. And thank you also for all that the X Prize is doing to kind of promote innovation. And if I may say so, both from the WMO and all of the Earth Commission and planetary boundaries work, this sort of innovation in the science community has been so important. Perhaps for those of you who are in the scientific community, you understand it. But for those of us who are adjacent to, but not deep in it, the enormous effort to pull together different research organizations, different modeling, different systems thinking to create a coherent set of boundaries and create warning systems. It's just a heroic and fantastic undertaking. And that brings us then to, well, who uses that information and what can we use the information for? So if we kind of flip that over to the business side, and of course there's a piece in the jigsaw here about government and policy as well, which I'll try to touch upon. And we have also a kind of systems challenge. So I might take the opportunity to offer a little bit of salt into the wound, then bring us back to somewhere where we can take a journey out of this. But it's important to bear this in mind because if you're an innovator, and you know, Anisha, from those, you've got so many great ideas that you stimulated in the X Prize. Johan, Lars, you've seen, people have got kind of great innovations and ideas. But there is this thing in the innovation community called the Valley of Death, whereby you can have a great idea and you can sort of start, and then when you try to scale it, it gets stuck. Because that next stage of funding or that next ability to crack into the market or get to scale doesn't happen, and ideas wither away. The same is very true if we go to a much bigger scale, if we take perhaps on the agricultural side or the energy system side, some of these big scale solutions. We've had a decade since the Copenhagen climate COP, if we remember that back in 2009, where we realized that the governmental community alone can't solve this challenge. We're going to need innovation, we're going to need technology, we're going to need scaled new business solutions, we're going to need entrepreneurs, we're going to need agility. But if you like, the system wasn't ready for that. And 2010 to 2015, when the Paris Climate Agreement was struck, was a period of innovation and intensity to try to create collaborations, not just within businesses, but between businesses, and not just between big businesses, but along their value chains and supply chains. So we saw a kind of plethora of partnerships and collaborations in tropical forestry, in methane partnerships, in energy efficiency, in circular economy. And that really dictated a decade, I'd say, up to the Glasgow COP of trying to have a lean-in from the business community who are at the kind of front end, if you like, on the left-hand side of that normal distribution curve, the first movers, the people who could see that innovation was required. I'm sure many of you have seen or been involved in some of those innovations, perhaps in clean shipping or sustainable aviation fuel pilot schemes, all of these sorts of things. We have a lot of that now. What we don't need and what we don't really will get much extra benefit from is another one of those, because they created confidence for Paris. There were great leading CEOs who interacted with Christiana Figueres, with Lawrence Tubiana, with Minister Fabius, and created confidence in that moment in 2015 that if an ambitious signal was put forward on climate, then there would not be resistance from the business community. One could see an innovation agenda that would take shape. That was 2015. That's 8 years ago. The world is a very different place from 8 years ago. Unfortunately, we have more of a fracturing now in terms of our international relations. We have less of a sense of liberalization and common borders, and we have more of competing trade zones. So we have a different geopolitical system within which to operate. But from the business community, it's also a very, very interesting parallel to what Johan has been leading and driving forward with the planetary boundaries analysis. So I don't know how many of you here in the audience are from a sort of private sector or business side. Okay. So I would imagine that if you're here, then you've also been kind of interested in the sustainable development agenda and how to shift the business model. So let's start that journey, because we know through initiatives which have cropped up through those collaborations that we have, at least on carbon, something called the Science-Based Targets Initiative. And you might be lucky enough to have guidance from this group of NGOs who take the science that Johan and Lars and others have created and try to plot a pathway to 2030 short-term, 2050 long-term, about the emissions reductions that one might need in that business model. it's actually quite hard if you're then tasked by your CEO or boss to come up with a kind of science-based target. Like, who do I ring? Who do I call? What does good look like? Where do I get the data from? Who do I work with to make that happen? Oh no, I'm the sustainability person. I'm in a large company. I have to work across thousands of employees and various different line functions to make that happen. Next step, if I have a science-based target, I also need a transition plan. I need an investment plan with CapEx and OpEx, HR functions to make it happen. Oh, that means I've got to talk to the chief financial officer. I don't really know her or him. I've got to use language which I haven't used before as a sustainability person. Once I might have triggered a transition plan, is that for the company as a whole? Is it just the sustainability? Oh, hang on a minute, this is quite fundamental. It's a systems transformation for the company. Then I've got to have an accounting procedure. Each year I've got to kind of display my progress against carbon emissions, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, use something called the greenhouse gas protocol. Any of you who are in this space know that scope 3 is quite complicated. There's all sorts of challenges about that. Then I've got to disclose it. So I have these new International Sustainability Standard Board guidelines coming through. I've got a lot of regulations in the EU. I've got a different thing in the US. This might sound quite boring if you're not from the business community, but the point is it's the same systems challenge as getting different scientific communities to come together from the atmosphere, the cryosphere, the biosphere, and put their models together. Because each of those pieces, the target setting, the disclosure planning, the accounting and the transition planning have grown up in different bits of our own economic space. Different organizations, a WWF, a WRI, a GRI, a CDP, an ISSB, have all very, very usefully grown different bits of that cottage industry, but have not been able yet to combine that so that we have a system which is frictionless, using the same data, such that millions of companies, not just a few hundred first movers, can easily go around that system and do what we know we need them to do. That is the challenge, not just in carbon, but if we are to take this very, very useful scientific information and apply it for a systems transformation for business, that's got to happen in nature. Yet we have prototype science-based targets for nature coming through, but we don't really yet have transition plans or a kind of end-to-end value chain for accounting for that, or a disclosure mechanism. We have to build it. If we take things like materials, plastics, we have a global plastics treaty coming through, the same thing. What is the target for what kinds of plastics? How do we have a transition plan? We have to build all these things. They are perfectly able to be built. The WBCSD, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, 270 of the leading companies in the world are leading in for these corporate performance and accountability systems. But the build of this has to happen super quickly, super smartly, and at the same time as that science is taking shape. So the kind of business world, working closely with those in the system who are setting regulatory standards or guidance on what should be disclosed or what should be accounted, is having to have that same kind of systems change as we've seen the scientific community come together to provide that integrated information. So on the one hand, how difficult is that? On the other hand, how interesting is that? Because we are absolutely seeing at that tipping point, if I can use that phrase, which Johan and Lars use a lot, in terms of the business and financial community, that is starting to happen. We're not there yet, but it's starting to happen because all of these pieces are coming together slowly to click in. The challenge is how can we actually crosswalk between what the science is now telling us to get business-friendly data and plug it into that target setting, transition planning, accounting, and disclosure system. And that's our combined task over the next several months, to create these corporate performance and accountability systems that will fundamentally create the foundation for millions of companies to be able to go on this journey which the science is telling us to go on.
Well, that's encouraging. That's very encouraging. And I know, Johan, you have looked at how we successfully did this. It's very hard. What you describe is very difficult to get coordination and collaboration between everyone. But Johan, you have seen this happen with the ozone crisis that we had and how the industry came together. Perhaps you can, talk a little bit about that. And also, we have a lot of people from the public and private sector, policymakers in the room and at this conference. And if you were to ask for an action that they can take to help on this journey, what would you ask them for?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I'll come to that by also linking back to Dominic's important reflection here. But thanks for raising the depletion of the stratospheric ozone layer, because this is one of the 9 planetary boundaries, and it's actually not only the only planetary boundary that in the 1980s was outside of its safe space, was deep in the red, and has now come back into the safe space. So it's the one and only example of how we as a global community have collectively acted on science and been able to transform ourselves back within a safe operating space for an existential threat. I mean, this is the stratospheric ozone layer that protects us from dangerous levels of UV radiation, which science showed in the early 1980s, which gave a Nobel Prize, that we were, through the release of chlorofluorocarbons, so the freons that were used for cooling agents and refrigerators and air conditioners, was through chemical reactions destroying the protective stratospheric ozone layer. Policy listened to science and signed the Montreal Protocol in 1987. And what was so remarkable with this is that industry was ready to step up and engage with policy to deliver solutions and innovate away from the CFCs, first to the HCFCs and then to the 3rd generation of chlorofluorocarbons. And NASA shows 2022 that we're now finally closing the stratospheric ozone hole over Antarctica, which to begin with is a great success story, but also shows the inertia and the enormous sensitivity of pushing systems too far and how long time it takes to repair if it is at all possible. But the unique lesson, what's the message here, was that no human being had ever seen a stratospheric, an ozone hole. So it wasn't as if we were hit by 500-year time storms and reacted on this threat. Oh no, we trusted science. We listened to rationality. We listened to facts, and we trusted our leaders. So it's quite an interesting example of how science, policy, and business interacted in a constructive way to take us out from probably a catastrophic impasse. And this, I think, is really important for us to recognize now that we can measure all the other 8 planetary boundaries equally well, that we need to have trust between science and broader citizenship. But what should also be said is that often I hear that the Montreal success with the ozone layer is not really comparable because the climate crisis is so much bigger. The energy transition is so much larger. It cuts across all the elements of society, and we don't really have the solutions as we had at the time. Industry was ready to deliver. I would argue that 10 years back, that was a correct criticism. But today, in line with what Dominic is saying, I think it doesn't hold anymore because we have the innovations. Business has stepped up the game. We've reached what I would call a Montreal moment on the climate crisis because the science is settled, just like with the stratospheric ozone layer in 1980s. We have the policy. The Paris Agreement is signed. It is a legally binding global agreement. All the text is now negotiated. We don't have anything more to negotiate. Now is the time to deliver. And we have the solutions. So the 3 Montreal boxes are actually ticked off. It's still more challenging, of course, because the energy transition cuts across the entire economy, of course, and that was not the case with CFCs. But it's quite interesting. I think we have lessons to learn here. And just my final remark, just to add to Dominic's point, what we experience in the scientific community is not only that there is this myriad of different reporting schemes, which is causing a lot of chaos and challenges for businesses on how to report on their ESG requirements. But one thing that is really significant is that the sustainability factor or agenda has rapidly moved up to the management level, to the C-suite level, and the CEO level. So it's today positioned in a strategic point of how to be prosperous as a business, how to be competitive as a company. And this, I believe, is a very, very significant development and a very positive one, that it's no longer about corporate social responsibility or some moral obligations. It's really about competitiveness of your company. And that shift, I think we should use even more prominently in our policy, science, civil society, and business interactions. And I think that is one of the missing links here, that we need much, much more kind of holding each other hands much more firmly to support policy and their decisions. Because I would also argue quite strongly, business cannot do it alone. We sometimes believe that business can innovate ourselves out to technological fixing of all these problems. That won't happen. We need citizens and we need policy. We need regulatory frameworks that can help the acceleration and the scaling.
Thank you. And before I go to the audience, Dominic, based on what you heard, and COP28 is coming up in a month and a half. So do you think we can have a Montreal moment at this COP, hopefully?
So I'd really concur with what Johan was saying there, and again, where Lars was coming from at the beginning. If we take the lessons from the Montreal Protocol, so this was a political leader, Bush Senior, recognizing the science, bringing together US industry. What was fascinating was that European industry wasn't keen to play because they felt threatened by a particular competitive advantage if it came out of the US. So what was required were common standards to be built to allow a level playing field for innovation to take place. So the lesson is very, very useful for today. If we can get common approaches to target setting, transition planning, accounting, and disclosure, you create the level playing field to allow innovators to scale and for first movers to be celebrated, to attract lower costs of capital into their businesses, and for laggards to be shown out. That is the Montreal Protocol moment that we have, not just for carbon, but for nature-related targets as well, with TNFD and the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, as well as TCFD. It is there for the taking, but it does require, as Johan was saying, a bridge to be built between the three systems outside of the Earth systems, which are on the, if you like, the economic and policy side. So we have the market system. We know that markets don't value, these externality issues enough in terms of company performance. For those of you who are in the private sector, you know that your discounted cash flow analysis, and maybe even your terminal value, just take no account of some of these risks that Johan was talking about. So how can we fold that into what a corporate valuation is? You know, for those of you in this space, when you talk to others, as we do, that you might be a company that works in food and beverage, and actually if this is to be true, what we just heard, it wipes out every profit in the next 20 years. But I can still have that completely not taken account of in my discounted cash flow and my terminal value. So the markets are still with me. So that is one bridge in the market side that we have to work with. And we can with this business useful information. The second is the economic system. The economic system where the policies and regulations that Johan was referring to support that trajectory to fold in those proper values into the valuation of a company. And we know that we have some movement in that space. We can see that, in G7 just recently, the G7 Alliance for Nature Positive Economies. It wants to, there is a movement in that space. If you read the G20 statement from India, if you're close to Brazil, we can see that the bio-based economy is coming through and could create value creation for the emerging markets. The third is the international governmental system, whereby we need those harmonized standards so that no matter which jurisdiction one's working in, the same kind of rules apply. We can fix those three systems. If we can rise to the challenge as the scientific community has and created the planetary boundaries, we can do this. And that is the work that is underway. And it's much more than leaning into a voluntary initiative on a particular theme. It is changing the boundaries of those systems inspired by what the Earth system scientists have done.
Thank you, Dominic. Any questions from the audience? Yes, ma'am.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the distinguished panelists. I'm Denise Garcia, professor of international law at Northeastern University in Boston. My question goes to Dominique and Anusha. If you kindly could have your thoughts on how the set of technologies under AI, the AI umbrella, and other technologies such as quantum could accelerate the role of the private sector and make it future-proof, despite any government that is in power in the US, for example, things would still stand. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I can get you started, and if you want to comment. So on the AI and quantum and the impact that it can have on our subject of our conversation, I think it has been helpful in the monitoring and collection of the data, and also prediction and simulation of Earth models. And this is an area, as AI capabilities advances and adding quantum capabilities in the future, which is not available today right now to help us on that. It really just makes the science more precise and makes the error bars shorter, which then brings more trust into the science and the data, and hopefully will drive the public and private sector to take action faster. I don't know, Dominic, if you want to add anything on the technology side of it.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate the question. And of course, I'll leave it to Lars and Johan to reflect on kind of, technology breakthroughs, AI, and the science itself. Yes. But certainly on the business side, there's a super development underway. So a lot of the compliance framework, particularly for businesses, pollute less, do less harm, on a historic, looking backwards. Are you a little bit better than where you were like 2 or 3 years ago? That's the sort of general inventory accounting for scope 1, scope 2, because where nature-based targets are coming from. What's been very, very interesting this last 12 months has been then the breakthrough, which has been supported and endorsed now by the G7 under Japan's presidency, is of intervention-based accounting. If we look forward over the next 10 years, if, for example, in the climate action space, if a company or enterprise is going to fundamentally shift its business model and provide goods and services which will drive zero carbon outcome into society, and you can measure that against a baseline, then that wedge of avoided emissions can then be something that policymakers and investors can get behind to encourage further growth in that space. The AI and other technologies to model exactly what that would look like, taking account of various parameters, is going to be so important, so that you take away any biases, if you like, from that. And having policy think tanks or reputable third parties run that would be amazing. So there's a very, very interesting opportunity for that in the space. And I'm sure with your legal background, you can sort of see the implications of that as well.
Yes. And by the way, Johan is also here, just not on the screen.
Sorry, just a question to the audience. How many of you were at Building Bridges last week? This was a week of conferences putting together the international financial community and the sustainability science UN agencies. So, apart from asking why, I can say that based on that feedback I saw from the financial community, the business community, is that they're very behind all this. There's not much backsliding, there's not much resistance to evidence. They are very happy about the new regulatory and accounting regimes that will allow them to comply with sustainability targets. What they kept saying was that what is missing is the policy. And this is not the policy as in the kind of international organizations that have created these bodies and these new standards. It's the politicians. It's the failure of leadership. It's the backsliding. It's the trimming. It's the kind of example that we have seen from the British government. And this is not just a failure of democracy. This is evidence to the same degree or far worse in the authoritarian regimes as well. Now, I'm not saying that there is an easy solution to this, but we are looking at very positive progress in the private and the public sector in all these areas except the politics. Now, I wish I could propose a solution, but can we at least point the blame where it lies?
Yeah.
Because I'm sure in each and every country here represented, we are familiar with this. And we need to find a way to deal with that, because otherwise we will see the kind of public policy, sorry, not public, the political failure that landed us in the First World War and the Second World War. The disaster predictions are equally grave. The political will to do anything about it and the readiness to avoid it seems equally prevalent.
Yeah. Lars, I don't know if you want to comment on that, but just to summarize, so Johan, I don't know if you could hear, in a very short summary, I guess the question is that it looks like the business sector and the private sector are aligned, and there is momentum behind moving in the right direction. We just need, accountable leadership, political leadership, to drive some of these initiatives. So, Lars, do you want to comment on that?
Very much so. Thank you very much for that comment, and I couldn't agree with you more. So we talked a lot about the role of the private sector and the role of science in this, and we have not talked enough about the role of the government. Johan is right when he said Paris is agreed, Paris is signed, but it has not yet been implemented. One of the key reasons why Paris could be agreed at all was Article 6. And Article 6 is still negotiated. It was still being negotiated. The details of how to implement Article 6, which is the one that talks about internationally transferred mitigation outcomes. So basically, in a nutshell, how do you pay your way out of avoiding to reduce your emissions? That's the unkind way of saying it. That was still being negotiated in Sharm el-Sheikh last year until 5 o'clock in the morning, and those negotiations ended without a result. So you who commented last, you are absolutely right. We are looking at, we're looking to our leaders here. The innovation is there. The information is there from the science. We can and we should measure the vital signs of the planet, as Johan said. And I gave you an example of one of the ones that, in my opinion, we are not talking about enough, namely the greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere. Remarkably, those are not really present in the discourse around the Paris Agreement. We talk about how much carbon we can put into the biosphere. We talk about carbon neutral. We talk about net zero. We talk about carbon offsetting. The atmosphere doesn't see any of that. The greenhouse gas concentrations keep rising, and we show this to the governments. When I say parties to the UNFCCC, those are governments. Those are the ones who meet at COP once a year and discuss this. And they say, yeah, this is not so good, and maybe the private sector will innovate their way out of this. They need to set rules that will drive the private sector to innovate ourselves out of this. And the private sector can. I'm fully convinced that they can. But they cannot do that without a regulatory framework. And that is the job of the politicians to establish.
Yes, up there. You, yes.
Hello, I'm Zoe Lopez. I'm 18 years old and I'm a Villar Institute fellow. I just wanted to ask about, recently we've been seeing a lot of backlash towards greenwashing and carbon credits, even at the Building Bridges Summit last week. And I was wondering if you've seen a difference in businesses' attitudes towards sustainable development now that there's a little bit more of a more complicated support from the public.
So I don't know, maybe Dominic, you want to answer that, or Johan? So the question is, with the claims of greenwashing and carbon credit markets, do we see a shift in attitude and the work of the private sector?
Happy to pick that up. Just to very quickly to the earlier conversation, I was at Building Bridges. I was part of the panel which was talking about rising inequality. So there's that famous European commissioner who said, we know what we have to do, but we don't know how to get elected once we've done it. So this transition of climate and planetary boundaries, which is an enormous transition. One cannot do that without also looking at the issue of social justice, social equality, and what people are calling the just transition. There are 10 people in the world, 9 men, 1 woman, 10 people in the world whose combined wealth is as much as 3.6 billion people. So, you know, it's not surprising that if you are a populist politician looking for votes, because that's your job in a way, in a democracy at least, you will go finding them where people are feeling insecure and unsure about what this world is holding. So in a strange way, yes, we do need political courage, but we have to, as change makers, understand that it is a climate, nature, and tackle inequality issue, 3 things all at the same time. We cannot separate those out, otherwise we won't get there. So that's just the point to your point there. It's a really super interesting one on the carbon credits and such. It's an issue that's coming of age because of the scale of money that could be transferred from businesses looking to find ways to help them in a high integrity way meet some of their short-term carbon targets, and at the same time, given the global biodiversity framework, the scale of financing that needs to go into landscapes and people is far bigger than the public purse holds. But bridging that is opening up a lot of different interesting and challenging events. And even within the INGO, the international NGO community, there's a split opinion about this. So this is just one, again, of these sorts of Schumpeterian moments where people are having to figure out what is good, what is perfect, and how we're going to get this done. So there is a phrase that's coming through called green hushing from the business side, where I am doing interesting things, but I don't really want to talk about them because the public opinion is so confused and divided that it's just going to make it all have a headache at the boardroom. So what we need to do is, in civil society, and in some of those voluntary target setting institutions, as well as the government and business community, is actually get some kind of coordination and discipline and kind of really focus on what we're going to have to do in the next 7 years. Perfect, good, 80% of the problem, or not. And that's a little bit of what's going on, I think, in that carbon credit space. The ability to measure what high integrity is very, very good. There are strong guidelines in place, but there's a little bit of discussion, if we can say, amongst those who are in parts of the community about good or perfect.
Thank you, Dominic. We are out of time. So, Johan, I'm going to come back to you if you want to comment on this, or if you could maybe give some closing thoughts for this audience as they walk out of this room to think about how they can contribute to getting us on the right path.
Yeah, thanks. Very, very short then. So, I mean, to begin with, I think it's just important to recognize that the business leaders in the world have really stepped out of their comfort zone to try and act as fast as possible on climate. Can you imagine that all the CEOs of the 6 truck manufacturers in Europe 3 years ago went out public to say that from 2040 onwards, they will stop selling internal combustion engine-driven trucks in order to be able to be at zero 10 years later, because it takes 10 years to design one whole new driving platform. And this just shows that business is ready to move. But I just come back to that we have to be very clear that it cannot be done by business alone. You need to have the policy frameworks. Just as both Dominic and Lars have been pointing out, you need brave leadership. And I think what we need to do in the run-up, particularly COP28, is to support the COP process. I certainly agree with that. But at the same time, add radical policy making to that, putting end dates on the combustion engine, really getting mitigation targets. We cannot go on as we're doing today to more or less hide the agenda of fossil fuel phase out in all the negotiations on Article 6 and the whole loss and damage agenda and food agenda and methane agenda and forest agenda. So I think in a group like the one that we meet today, to keep our heads cold, so to say, and recognize the complexity of the agenda, but also what are the key priorities. And key priority now, in my view, is to start phasing out coal, oil, and gas in a way that follows the pathway defined by science. And we have that, so to say, headlight on, and I think we can move in that direction.
Thank you. And Lars?
Just one comment on this idea of innovating and the innovation of the private sector, and needing to frame that with policy. We need to be. Dominique said something very interesting. He said there's a whole cottage industry of regulatory initiatives and guidelines, etc. It's good. It means that there's immense innovation potential and immense energy there, but we need to make sure that this is channeled into something that the atmosphere sees. I keep coming back to that. There are very detailed guidelines about how to bookkeep your emissions and how to calculate scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, and what can you do to mitigate and offset it. We need to make sure that that is channeled into something the atmosphere sees. If we do not do this, then we are kidding ourselves and each other. If it doesn't actually bend down the greenhouse gas concentration curves, then all we are doing is creative bookkeeping, and we need to make absolutely sure that does not happen, because that is not climate change mitigation. And I go back to the point that I made already. Politicians have a role to play in this. They cannot defer that to the business sector alone. The science, as Jon has said, science is largely telling them what they need to know. They do need to act in order to make this easier for business.
Thank you, Lars. And Dominic, any closing thoughts?
Well, very, very swiftly, the International Sustainability Standards Board, I think, is a kind of key piece of activity at the moment, which is trying to set guidance for global standards on sustainability, both in climate and in nature, and in a couple of other key topics, potentially even social issues into the future, because sustainable development, of course, is economic, environment, and society. And that is going to help to kind of be the pull that will sort of industrialize this accounting and disclosure community away from cottage and into mainstream. So it's a super important initiative chaired by someone called Emmanuel Faber, who used to be the CEO of Danone, so he kind of knows what the business community needs. And that's a very, very important space to watch over the next several months. First guidance has already dropped, and we can build around that to exactly your point of creating something that the atmosphere and the climate will absolutely notice.
So at X Prize, we say the best way to predict the future is to create it. And I hear from everyone here that we have the data, we have the knowledge, we have the innovation. It just requires our collaboration and the will to make it happen. So hopefully you walk away with this message, and in whatever you do every day, you try to promote this agenda. Thank you for participating.